The story begins in a quiet Indiana suburb, the kind of place where kids ride bicycles until dusk and neighbors wave from neatly trimmed lawns. But behind one of those tidy doors, a family would soon face something that defied logic, morality, and even the boundaries of human understanding. It started with an act of kindness, the decision to adopt a child in need. Yet what followed was so strange, so psychologically disturbing, that it would divide experts, shock the public, and leave everyone wondering, was this an innocent child or a grown woman pretending to be one? In 2010, Christine and Michael Barnett believed they were living a dream. They had 3 sons, bright, curious boys, and a comfortable home in Westfield, Indiana. But they also had room in their hearts for one more. When an adoption agency contacted them about a little girl from Ukraine named Natalia Grace, they felt a tug of compassion. Natalia, they were told, was 6 years old and suffering from a rare form of dwarfism called spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia, a condition that affected her bones and stature. She needed a home, stability, and love. The Barnetts thought they could give her that. From the very first moment Christine saw her, Natalia appeared fragile. Tiny frame, wide brown eyes, a small girl who seemed both vulnerable and precocious. Christine lifted her into her arms and promised that she would never again have to feel alone. The paperwork was signed, the court approved the adoption, and Natalia officially became part of the Barnett family. What could possibly go wrong? But something was off, almost immediately. Christine would later recall moments that seemed not quite right. Natalia's behavior was inconsistent. One moment she'd speak in a childish tone, giggling and drawing pictures. The next, her words were strangely mature, even manipulative. At first, Christine brushed it off. Maybe it was trauma, or the effects of living in foster care. But over time, her instincts whispered something more disturbing. There were tiny clues, small, unsettling details that crept into daily life. The first time Natalia took a bath, Christine noticed something that froze her: signs of adult physical development, unmistakable to a mother's eye. She said nothing at first. How could she? To voice that suspicion felt insane. Yet the questions multiplied. Natalia didn't seem to grow. Months passed, then years, and her body remained unchanged. Her vocabulary, however, was unusually advanced. She used phrases and words far beyond her supposed age. Once, she casually mentioned things that no child her age should know, about dating, about alcohol, about life, in ways that hinted at lived experience rather than childhood fantasy. Christine confided in Michael, and together they began quietly observing her. What they saw unsettled them deeply. Natalia's interactions with their younger sons were increasingly strange. At times aggressive, at times eerily watchful. One evening, Christine claimed she found Natalia standing over her while she slept, silent, expressionless. Another time, she allegedly poured bleach into Christine's coffee. The house, once filled with laughter, turned cold. Christine began locking the bedroom doors at night. Michael, once the calm one, became distant, overwhelmed by what he could no longer explain. The couple reached out for help. Psychologists, doctors, adoption specialists, each had theories, but none could agree. Some said Natalia was simply a traumatized child acting out. Others believed something far stranger. A doctor who examined her dental records suggested she was not a child at all, estimating her age to be well into her teens, possibly her 20s. The Barnetts were horrified. If that were true, then who or what had they brought into their home? In 2012, after a particularly disturbing incident, details of which remain debated, the Barnetts took drastic action. They petitioned the court to legally change Natalia's birth year from 2003 to 1989, effectively reclassifying her as an adult. The judge, relying on medical testimony, approved the change. Overnight, the little girl who had been 6 years old was now a 22-year-old woman, at least on paper. The Barnetts rented her an apartment, paid the rent for a year, and moved to Canada to support their gifted son's education. Natalia, now officially an adult, was left to live independently. But that's when the story took another sinister turn. Neighbors soon began reporting strange encounters. Natalia wandering the streets, appearing confused, knocking on doors, asking for help. One family took her in, believing she was a child abandoned by her adoptive parents. To them, she seemed lost and scared, not a manipulative adult. The media caught wind, and the story exploded. The child who might be an adult. The parents who abandoned their daughter. It sounded like a twisted fairy tale, except every version contradicted the other. The Barnetts insisted they were victims of an elaborate deception, that Natalia was a sociopathic adult who had infiltrated their family under false pretenses. But Natalia, interviewed years later, told a very different story, that she was indeed a child, discarded by the only people who were supposed to love her. In the quiet corners of the internet, theories multiplied. Some called it a real-life orphan case, referencing the 2009 horror movie where a woman posed as a child to infiltrate a family. Others argued the Barnetts were delusional, projecting fears onto a vulnerable girl with medical challenges. The truth, somewhere in between, was murky and chilling. To this day, one cannot hear the name Natalia Grace without feeling a twinge of unease, because the story isn't just about a child or an imposter. It's about perception, fear, and the fragile boundary between compassion and paranoia. The Barnetts believed they'd opened their home to a little girl in need. What they got instead was a mystery that would haunt them and the public for years to come. And as the camera pans out, back to that quiet Indiana neighborhood, you can almost hear the whisper of that first question again, the one that began it all. What if the person you welcomed as family wasn't who they claimed to be? At first, Christine tried to convince herself she was overreacting. Every parent of an adopted child is warned about adjustment periods, about the turbulence that comes with trauma. She told herself that Natalia's strange moods, the sudden bursts of anger, the eerie quiet staring, were just signs of fear and confusion. After all, the girl had spent years in orphanages. Maybe this was how she survived, but the cracks widened fast. Natalia's behavior began to disturb even the smallest routines of the house. During dinner, she would sometimes fix her gaze on one of the Barnetts' sons and refuse to look away, fork frozen mid-air, lips curled in a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Christine would ask her to stop, and Natalia would slowly turn back to her plate, whispering something inaudible. In the mornings, Christine found clumps of hair in the bathtub, bits of shattered glass near Natalia's bed. Once, she discovered a puddle of bleach on the kitchen counter, the faint chemical scent lingering. When she confronted Natalia, the girl didn't deny it. She just said calmly, "I wanted to hurt them. I wanted them to go away." Christine's breath caught. The child's voice was steady, detached, not the outburst of an angry 6-year-old, but something older, darker, restrained. That night, she locked her bedroom door. It became a routine. Each evening, after tucking the boys in, she would double-check the locks, peek through the crack of Natalia's door, and listen. Sometimes she could hear whispering, not playful chatter or imaginary friends, but low murmurs in a language Christine couldn't understand. Other nights, Natalia would just stand at the window, staring out at the dark street below. Michael, who initially dismissed Christine's concerns, started noticing things too. One afternoon, while fixing a chair in the living room, he caught Natalia watching him from the hallway mirror, her reflection unmoving even after he turned around. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He told Christine later that night, his voice quiet, "She doesn't blink like a kid. She looks at you like she's studying you." The tension inside the house thickened. The Barnetts tried therapy, medication, anything that might explain what was happening. But every session with a psychologist ended with more confusion than clarity. Natalia's answers were inconsistent, evasive, and often chillingly perceptive. One therapist wrote in her notes that Natalia displays knowledge and emotional detachment, atypical for her claimed age. Another commented that she seemed to role-play childlike behavior when prompted, as if rehearsing innocence. By 2011, the family dynamic had shifted completely. Natalia was no longer the sweet little girl they had adopted. She was now the silent center of every argument, the unspoken fear that lingered between them. Christine found herself watching her constantly, afraid to leave her alone with the boys, afraid of what might happen if she looked away too long. Then came the incident with the fence. One summer evening, the Barnetts' neighbors were hosting a cookout. Children ran between yards, chasing each other in the fading light. Natalia sat apart, cross-legged in the grass, sketching in a small notebook. When Christine approached, she noticed the drawings, not flowers or houses, but stick figures lying in pools of red, crude symbols drawn around them. Christine snatched the notebook and demanded to know what it was. Natalia looked up, smiled, and said softly, "It's what I'm going to do to your family." That night, Christine called a psychiatrist in tears. They arranged an emergency evaluation. But by the time they arrived, Natalia had flipped again, crying, trembling, playing the part of a terrified child. The doctors saw a small girl with a disability. Overwhelmed and misunderstood, they recommended patience. Christine wanted to scream. Michael, torn between disbelief and fear, tried to stay logical. But then came a night that would change everything. Christine was awoken by a faint sound, the creak of floorboards. She looked up and saw Natalia standing at the foot of the bed, clutching a knife. The details of what happened next differed depending on whose account you believe. But Christine swore she wrestled the knife away while Natalia whispered that she wanted to kill everyone in the house. Michael, startled awake, confirmed the confrontation, though years later he would say he never saw a knife, only a look in her eyes that didn't belong to a child. After that, the family's fear turned into something close to horror. Christine began documenting everything, every strange remark, every threat, every medical record that didn't add up. She discovered that the adoption papers from Ukraine were inconsistent, with missing hospital information and conflicting height measurements. In the following months, she took Natalia to multiple specialists. One doctor claimed her bone density was consistent with an older teenager. Another suggested she had undergone puberty long before adoption. Christine's worst fears seemed confirmed. She began to see Natalia not as a daughter, but as an intruder, a stranger who had entered her home under false pretenses. Yet part of her resisted that belief, haunted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong, that Natalia was a child broken by a life she couldn't control. The media hadn't yet heard of the case. To the outside world, the Barnetts were still an ordinary family. But inside that quiet Indiana home, the sense of safety had completely vanished. Natalia's presence was no longer simply unsettling, it was unbearable. Christine couldn't eat without feeling eyes on her. Michael started spending more nights away, claiming work stress but really escaping the constant tension. Every sound in the house felt amplified. A thump upstairs, a door creaking open, a faint giggle in the hall. Christine kept a diary. In one entry, later found by investigators, she wrote, "She's not what they told us she is. There's something ancient in her eyes. I don't know what she wants, but it isn't love." The Barnetts' dream of saving a child had turned into a waking nightmare, one that neither of them could fully explain. And in the shadows of their home, the mystery of Natalia Grace was only beginning to unfold, because the question that haunted them most wasn't how old she really was. It was who she truly was. The breaking point for the Barnetts didn't come with one single event. It came with an accumulation of small horrors, each one pushing them further toward the edge of disbelief. The tension inside their home had grown thick, poisonous, almost unbreathable. Christine had stopped sleeping. Michael had started drinking more. The boys, once noisy and carefree, whispered instead of laughed. Every night felt like a vigil, waiting for something to happen. Christine began to study Natalia's every movement, every inconsistency. She compared old photos, measured height differences, even charted her growth patterns against medical records. What she found only deepened her dread. Natalia hadn't grown a single inch in the years since adoption. Her teeth, already fully developed when she arrived, showed no signs of childhood growth or loss. One physician, after reviewing the X-rays, quietly told Christine that her skeletal structure looked that of an adult. "Maybe 20, maybe older," he said. That was when Christine's compassion gave way to fear, and her fear hardened into conviction. She's not a child. she told Michael one night, her hands trembling as she held the reports. "She's lying to us. They all are." Michael didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny the strange truth in front of him. Every instinct told him something was off. He tried to find rational explanations. Delayed growth, trauma, malnutrition, but none of them fit. The moments of sweetness Natalia sometimes displayed now felt calculated, like a performance. Then came the hospital visit that would change everything. Christine arranged for Natalia to be admitted for psychiatric evaluation after another violent outburst, one that left their youngest son screaming in terror. At the facility, doctors began their assessments. Natalia's behavior shifted between extremes: childlike innocence and cold, analytical defiance. She spoke fluently about complex adult topics, then suddenly feigned confusion when asked about her early childhood in Ukraine. One physician wrote in his evaluation, "Patient demonstrates patterns inconsistent with stated age. Emotional comprehension and reasoning capabilities align closer to late adolescence or early adulthood." Another added something that would later echo through the media: "It is possible the patient is a fully grown individual presenting herself as a minor." When Christine and Michael received those reports, it was as if their nightmare had been given official confirmation, and yet there was no clear answer, no definitive proof. Just suggestions, doubts, fragments of data that could be interpreted either way. Still, Christine's mind was made up. If Natalia wasn't a child, then everything they'd done, the adoption, the care, the trust, had been part of an elaborate deception. They had been tricked into bringing a stranger into their lives, someone capable of manipulating an entire system. What terrified Christine most wasn't the idea that Natalia was dangerous. It was the thought that she might be invisible within the law, too old to be protected as a child, too young looking to be treated as an adult. That paradox would soon ignite a legal storm unlike anything Indiana had ever seen. In 2012, with the help of an attorney, Christine and Michael filed a petition in Marion County Court. They asked that Natalia's official birth year be changed from 2003 to 1989, effectively making her an adult overnight. The evidence they presented included medical reports, psychological assessments, and the couple's testimony about her behavior. What's chilling is how quickly it happened. Without much resistance, the court approved the request. There was no international verification, no Ukrainian inquiry, just a ruling that rewrote a person's life on paper. Natalia Grace, once a 6-year-old orphan, was now legally 22 years old. Christine claimed relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The ruling meant Natalia was now independent, an adult responsible for herself. But what does one do with an adult who looks like a child? The question seemed absurd, but it was terrifyingly real. The Barnetts decided to move her into a small Lafayette apartment. They furnished it, paid the rent for a year, stocked the fridge, and left her with groceries and some cash. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it was unthinkable. They were leaving behind someone who, by appearance, still looked like a little girl. The day they drove away, Christine described glancing back through the rearview mirror and seeing Natalia standing at the window, motionless, watching them. "She didn't wave," Christine said later. "She just stood there, staring, like she knew she'd won." But the story didn't end there. If anything, it only grew stranger. Natalia's neighbors soon began noticing her. She seemed lost, confused, knocking on doors asking for help. One woman said she introduced herself as a child abandoned by her parents. Another recalled Natalia insisting she was still a minor, crying that "they lied about me." When the Barnetts moved to Canada shortly after, claiming they had to support their prodigy son's education, local authorities took notice. Questions started to rise. Why would a couple abandon a disabled girl, regardless of her age? Why did no one from the adoption agency step forward to clarify her records? As whispers spread, the media caught the scent of something extraordinary. By 2014, the story of "the child who wasn't" had exploded across tabloids and talk shows. A family terrorized by a sociopath posing as a child. A couple accused of abandoning a disabled daughter. The public didn't know whom to believe. and that uncertainty became the fuel for endless speculation. To some, Christine and Michael were heroes, victims of a shocking deception. To others, they were villains, cold-hearted adults who discarded a vulnerable child. And to everyone else, Natalia Grace became a riddle that blurred the line between innocence and monstrosity. In interviews, Natalia insisted she had never lied about her age, that the Barnetts had fabricated everything to rid themselves of a responsibility they no longer wanted. Her voice, soft but steady, carried both pain and defiance. "I was just a kid," she said. "They left me like trash." Meanwhile, Christine's diary entries grew darker. She wrote about guilt, confusion, and a creeping doubt that maybe they had gone too far. One haunting line read, "If she is a child, then I've done something unforgivable. But if she's not, then God help us all." It was no longer a matter of science or law. It had become a story of perception, fear, and the terrible power of believing what you need to believe. By the time investigators reopened the case years later, the damage was irreversible. Families divided, reputations shattered, and the name Natalia Grace had become synonymous with one question that no one could answer. Was she the victim of monstrous parents, or the monster they feared she was? When the story of Natalia Grace broke into the public eye, it was unlike anything journalists had ever seen. It wasn't just another adoption gone wrong. It was a living nightmare that blurred the boundaries between truth and delusion, compassion and paranoia. For the first time, the nation was confronted with a question so bizarre it felt fictional. Could a family be terrorized by a woman pretending to be a child, or had they abandoned an innocent little girl and rewritten her age to escape guilt? News vans crowded the quiet cul-de-sac of the Barnetts' old neighborhood. Camera crews knocked on doors. Reporters lingered on sidewalks, hoping to glimpse the girl at the center of the chaos. Every image they captured, Natalia's small frame, wide eyes, fragile stature, contradicted the idea that she could be an adult. She looked like a child, sounded like one, moved like one, and yet the court order said otherwise. Within days, the story went global. The real-life orphan case, tabloids called it, referencing the 2009 horror film about a murderous woman posing as a child to infiltrate a family. The comparison was irresistible to audiences. Talk shows replayed the same haunting photos, the Barnetts smiling beside a tiny girl who might not be a girl at all. YouTube videos dissected every frame. Reddit threads bloomed with speculation. Christine Barnett, who once prided herself on being a devoted mother and educator, was suddenly branded a monster. She left a child to fend for herself, the headlines screamed. But Christine fought back. She appeared on talk shows, her voice trembling yet defiant. "We were the victims," she said. "We adopted an adult who deceived us, threatened us, and made our home unsafe." She described the night Natalia allegedly stood at the foot of her bed with a knife, and the times she found her smearing blood on mirrors, whispering death threats under her breath. The audience gasped. It sounded like fiction, but Christine swore every word was true. Michael, more reserved, stood by her side, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Behind closed doors, their marriage was crumbling under the pressure, the public fascination, the legal chaos, the constant second-guessing. It was too much. The fear that had begun in their home had now spilled into the world, consuming them. Meanwhile, Natalia's life took another strange turn. After being discovered by a compassionate couple, Anton and Cynthia Manns, she moved into their home. The Manns believed her story completely, that she was a child wronged by her adoptive parents, not a dangerous imposter. They enrolled her in school, introduced her to neighbors, and treated her like a daughter. But rumors followed her like a shadow. Parents at the school complained. Some teachers whispered that Natalia's behavior didn't match her supposed age. Again, one said she carried herself like someone much older, often sitting apart from children, speaking with adult vocabulary, and showing little interest in play. Yet, every attempt to question her age hit a wall of conflicting paperwork and fading memories. The mystery deepened when journalists began digging into her Ukrainian origins. The adoption agency that placed her had since closed, and records were incomplete. Hospitals listed in her files couldn't confirm her birth. Even the orphanage director, who once knew her, gave contradictory statements. First calling her a child, then admitting her age was uncertain. As the chaos spread, authorities in Indiana reopened the case. What they found was a labyrinth of conflicting documents, medical assessments, and personal testimony. A forensic expert re-examined Natalia's X-rays, concluding she was likely a teenager at the time of adoption. Another insisted she was in her early 20s. The truth seemed to shift depending on who was looking. Detectives interviewed both sides. Natalia, by then living independently, maintained her innocence. In one chilling interview, she said softly, "They wanted me gone. They made up stories to get rid of me. I never hurt anyone." But her words were sometimes contradictory. When pressed about her early childhood, she grew vague, saying she didn't remember much or had to pretend to survive. Christine and Michael, in turn, painted themselves as victims of a con. She was dangerous, Christine said during her police interview. "She threatened to kill us. She told me she wanted to stab my children. What were we supposed to do?" As evidence mounted, both sides seemed believable, and yet both impossible. Investigators grew frustrated. "It's like looking at two different realities," one detective later said. "They each make sense, but they can't both be true." In 2019, the case reached a boiling point when prosecutors charged the Barnetts with neglect of a dependent, claiming they had abandoned a child. The public gasped. Suddenly, the couple who claimed to be victims were now defendants in a criminal case. But then, almost as quickly, the charges began to crumble. Natalia's legal age, the very one that the court had changed years earlier, complicated everything. How could they be charged with abandoning a child when, on paper, she was an adult? The system that once seemed to protect the Barnetts now worked in their favor. The prosecution's case fell apart under the weight of conflicting evidence and bureaucratic chaos. In 2022, the court dismissed the charges against Michael Barnett. Christine, though publicly shamed and emotionally shattered, was also cleared. Legally, they were innocent. But socially, morally, the verdict was far murkier. The public was left with a haunting paradox. If Natalia had truly been an adult, the Barnetts had been victims of an extraordinary fraud. But if she had been a child, then they had committed an unthinkable act, abandoning a little girl and branding her a monster. No one could say for sure. The case became a mirror, reflecting whatever people believed about fear, truth, and trust. Journalists described it as the perfect modern horror story, one not driven by ghosts or demons, but by something far more chilling: uncertainty. The idea that reality itself could fracture, that two versions of the same story could coexist, each convincing in its own way. In the aftermath, Natalia remained a quiet enigma. She lived with a new guardian, rarely speaking to the press. When she did, her tone was wary, distant, not angry, just hollow. "I didn't ask for this," she said in one rare interview. "I just wanted a family." The camera lingered on her as she spoke, a small figure in oversized clothes, her eyes old beyond her years. Somewhere between victim and villain, child and adult, truth and illusion, she sat as the world tried to decide what she was. And in that silence, one truth echoed louder than any verdict. No matter how many doctors, courts, or cameras tried to explain her, the mystery of Natalia Grace remained unsolved. In the years that followed, the Natalia Grace case evolved into something more than a legal or moral question. It became a psychological labyrinth, a slow, spiraling descent into fear, guilt, and denial. Everyone involved, from Natalia to the Barnetts to the families who later took her in, seemed to lose their grip on what was real. And perhaps, in that confusion, lies the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes the horror isn't in the act itself, but in the uncertainty that lingers after. Christine Barnett once described herself as a mother who believed in miracles. Before Natalia entered their lives, she had built a reputation for nurturing gifted children, including her own son, Jacob, a child prodigy. She saw herself as someone who could heal the broken, an idealist armed with patience and love. But after the adoption, that identity began to rot from within. She claimed she tried to love Natalia, but said every attempt was met with manipulation and deceit. And slowly, love gave way to fear. She wrote in her diary about the day she caught Natalia standing motionless in the hallway, watching her sleep. Her eyes didn't blink, Christine wrote. She smiled like she knew something I didn't. It might have been an innocent misunderstanding, or the start of an unraveling mind. When fear takes root in the heart, everything looks like a threat. Michael, the father, became increasingly detached, caught between his wife's growing panic and his own unease. He wanted to believe Christine, but something about the story felt off. Too perfect, too rehearsed. Maybe she's not evil, he told a friend once. Maybe she's just broken. But by then, the line between compassion and survival had blurred. Their home, once filled with laughter and the hum of science experiments, turned into a fortress. Knives were locked away. Bedroom doors stayed shut at night. Christine claimed she slept with the lights on, convinced Natalia would harm her in her sleep. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was obsession. And obsession, when fed by the unknown, can become madness. For Natalia, isolation became her only companion. Whether she was truly a grown woman or a child, one fact remained unchanged: she was alone, rejected, doubted, and passed from family to family. She became the ghost of a story no one could tell correctly. In interviews, her voice carried exhaustion, not rage. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she once said. "Every time I look in the mirror, I see what they said I was." Those words cut deeper than any accusation, because beneath all the horror and confusion, there was a human being, one who might have simply been misunderstood or might have been playing a role so long that even she forgot where it began. The psychologists who studied the case later described it as a rare collision of trauma and projection. The Barnetts, they theorized, may have seen in Natalia the embodiment of their own fears, the fear of failure, of imperfection, of love gone wrong. Christine had built her identity around being the perfect mother, the savior of lost children. But when faced with someone she couldn't fix, that identity shattered. Instead of admitting defeat, she rewrote the story, casting herself as the victim of a dangerous imposter. If that's true, then the horror of the Natalia Grace case isn't supernatural. It's psychological. It's the story of what happens when empathy collapses under the weight of expectation. Still, not everyone believed the Barnetts' unraveling was self-inflicted. Some saw genuine signs that Natalia was not who she claimed to be. Medical records showed inconsistencies in bone density scans. Dentists noted adult molar patterns. There were whispers from neighbors about her strange mannerisms, how she would flirt with older men or make unsettling jokes. These details, though small, painted her as someone out of place in her supposed age group. But even those observations were tainted by bias. Humans see what they expect to see, especially when fear and rumor take the lead. One forensic psychiatrist put it bluntly: by the time anyone met Natalia, they already had a version of her in their head, demon or victim. And once a person is painted that way, you stop seeing the truth. The story spiraled further when documentaries and talk shows began to capitalize on the sensational nature of the case. Producers edited clips for shock value, emphasizing Christine's trembling voice or Natalia's eerie silence. The line between reporting and entertainment vanished. What was left was a caricature, a fractured reflection of reality where every participant looked monstrous in their own way. By then, Christine's emotional stability had completely deteriorated. Friends who once admired her distanced themselves. Some said she had become erratic, obsessed with proving her innocence, replaying old messages, printing screenshots, and collecting files like a detective in her own crime. Michael, now divorced from Christine, described her as consumed by the narrative. She couldn't move on, because the story never ended, and Natalia, she became a quiet symbol of something larger, of society's need to categorize people into heroes and villains, living when neither fits. Living under constant scrutiny, she withdrew. One neighbor remembered her sitting alone on the porch at night, humming softly to herself. It wasn't creepy, the neighbor said. It was sad, like she didn't belong anywhere. Over time, both women, the mother and the daughter, seemed to mirror each other's suffering. Each claimed betrayal. Each insisted the other had destroyed her life. Both might have been right in their own way. That's what makes this story so chilling. There's no clean truth, no villain you can point to, no innocent to protect. Only people trapped inside a narrative that grew larger than them, twisting memories into monsters. Even now, psychologists debate the deeper meaning of it all. Was it a rare case of psychogenic delusion, where fear and suggestion rewrite reality? Or was it the most convincing deception ever carried out by one person desperate for belonging? There's no answer. There never will be. But as one reporter who followed the case from the beginning said, it doesn't matter whether Natalia was a child or an adult. What matters is that everyone involved lost a part of themselves trying to prove it. The horror, in the end, wasn't that someone lied. It was that no one could ever trust again, not even themselves. By the time the story of Natalia Grace hit the mainstream, it had already twisted itself into something unrecognizable. The first whispers appeared in 2019, when headlines screamed across the internet, "Parents adopt a child who turned out to be a psychotic adult." The phrase alone was enough to spark a wildfire of fascination and fear. In an era where every tragedy becomes a meme and every mystery becomes content, Natalia's story was irresistible, part horror film, part moral puzzle. Overnight, the world decided who was innocent and who was evil, and from that point forward, the truth no longer mattered. Television hosts dissected the case like vultures around a carcass. Commentators debated whether the Barnetts were monsters who abandoned a disabled child, or heroes who narrowly escaped a sociopath. YouTubers, podcasters, and self-proclaimed detectives flooded the internet with theories. Some swore Natalia was a fraud, a con artist manipulating her way into sympathy. Others saw her as a victim of cruel parents who needed a scapegoat. The case, once confined to courtrooms and medical offices, now lived in living rooms and on smartphones. A digital ghost haunting millions of minds. But here's the tragedy. The more people talked, the less they knew. Each retelling warped the details. One outlet claimed Natalia had confessed to plotting murder. She hadn't. Another said she spoke fluent Russian and cursed in a deep adult voice. Baseless rumor. A photo of her standing next to a much taller man became evidence. She was an adult. The internet didn't care about accuracy, it cared about narrative. And Natalia's face, pale, expressionless with those wide, uncertain eyes, became the perfect blank canvas for fear. Christine and Michael Barnett leaned into the media storm at first, appearing on talk shows to defend themselves. Christine's voice would tremble as she recalled the terror of living with Natalia. "I found her standing over my bed with a knife," she claimed in one interview, though no police report ever confirmed it. Viewers watched her cry on camera, watched her husband nod solemnly beside her, and for a while they believed. But something about the performance, the rehearsed pauses, the carefully chosen words started to feel off. It wasn't just desperation, it was calculation. Meanwhile, Natalia remained mostly silent, her voice filtered through lawyers and court filings. When she finally appeared on screen years later, in a documentary, the effect was haunting. Her voice was small, her eyes full of restrained anger. "They said I was evil," she whispered. "But I was just a child. I just wanted a family." Those words struck like a blade, simple, devastating, and impossible to verify. Because by that point, no one could agree on what truth even was. The documentaries that followed, first on Investigation Discovery, then a longer series on another network, blurred fact and performance until the story resembled something closer to fiction. Reenactments showed a small figure moving through dimly lit hallways. The camera lingered on knives, shadows, flickering lights. The editors amplified Christine's paranoia into cinematic terror. It wasn't journalism anymore. It was entertainment disguised as truth. One of the producers later admitted in an interview that they weren't trying to find answers. They were trying to evoke emotion. "It's not about what really happened," he said. "It's about what it felt like to live through it." But by dramatizing fear, They ensured that fear became the defining truth. The Barnetts became symbols of parental horror. Natalia became a walking question mark. Part victim, part villain, part urban legend. Even professionals in the field were divided. Psychologists debated her bone scans and behavior patterns on social media threads like armchair detectives. Medical experts pointed out that growth disorders can make age estimation difficult, while others argued the scans proved she was much older than claimed. But the louder the debate got, the quieter the facts became. Everyone had an opinion, no one had certainty. The case drew comparisons to films like Orphan, where a child turns out to be an adult woman posing as a little girl. The irony was uncanny, almost cinematic in itself. The movie had been released years before Natalia's story went public, yet it now felt like a prophecy. People began calling Natalia the real-life orphan, a nickname she could never escape. Even casual viewers stopped seeing her as human. She was an archetype, a character that embodied their fears of deceit, madness, and misplaced trust. For the Barnetts, fame became a new kind of prison. Every interview, every public appearance only fueled the controversy further. The backlash was brutal. Strangers sent hate mail. Protesters appeared near their home. Online forums tore their personal lives apart. Christine claimed she received death threats. Michael lost business opportunities. Their once idyllic suburban life dissolved into constant scrutiny. They wanted to tell their side of the story, but the story had outgrown them. And Natalia, her existence became an echo, a rumor passed from screen to screen. When new families tried to help her, they were warned of her past. Even if she truly had been a child, her identity had been permanently rewritten. One foster mother described her as quiet and polite, but always carrying sadness in her eyes, like she knew she'd never be believed. Some nights, Natalia reportedly called her social worker just to ask, "Do you think I'm bad?" There's no evidence she ever harmed anyone, no proof she was violent or deceptive. Yet the narrative had already made her into something monstrous. And once the internet names you a villain, redemption becomes impossible. The public's fascination with the case was almost morbid. People wanted closure, not justice. They wanted to feel afraid, safely, from behind a screen. And in giving them that, the media had turned a complex, tragic situation into a modern horror myth, a living story to be consumed and forgotten when the next scandal arrived. Even after years, new documentaries and podcasts resurrected the story again and again, each promising to reveal the real truth. But every new version contradicted the last. The Barnetts accused new networks of misrepresentation. Natalia accused them of exploitation. Audiences no longer watched to learn, they watched to feel, to experience that strange mix of pity and terror that only real-life horror can offer. In the end, the Natalia Grace story stopped being about Natalia at all. It became about us, about the way we feed on mystery, the way we turn pain into spectacle. How easily empathy dies in the shadow of entertainment. And maybe that's the real curse of this story, not the question of who lied or who suffered, but what it reveals about us, that we crave monsters so badly, we'll invent them if we must. By the time the dust began to settle, nothing about the Natalia Grace case resembled a family tragedy anymore. It had mutated into a modern myth, a riddle so layered in half-truths and courtroom whispers that even those closest to it seemed unsure what had truly happened. When the police finally stepped in, it was not to uncover a murderer, but to make sense of something far murkier, a story where no one was innocent and no one was entirely guilty. It began when local authorities received a disturbing tip: a disabled girl, allegedly only 9 years old, had been left alone in an apartment in Lafayette, Indiana. No food, no family, no guardian, just rent payments made in her name. When police entered the home, they found signs of neglect, but also peculiar traces of adult behavior, adult hygiene products, mail addressed to Natalia Grace Barnett, and a calendar marked with medical appointments. To investigators, it was a paradox. Was this a neglected child or a self-sufficient adult? The Barnetts claimed the latter. The system wasn't so sure. As the investigation deepened, the Barnetts' story grew even more surreal. They insisted they had done nothing wrong, In interviews and police statements, Christine repeated her now infamous claim: Natalia wasn't a little girl. She was a woman, a sociopath, pretending to be a child. She painted herself as the survivor of a cruel deception, but documents began to surface: school records, hospital visits, immigration papers, all placing Natalia's birth year closer to 2003, not 1989 as Christine had argued. If true, that meant the Barnetts had abandoned a minor and falsified court records to cover their tracks. The legal proceedings became a media circus. Prosecutors accused the Barnetts of neglect and abandonment, while their defense argued they had been misled by the adoption agency. Courtroom footage from those days shows Michael Barnett sitting rigid, hands clasped, avoiding eye contact with his ex-wife. Christine, by contrast, was fiery and defiant, a woman convinced that only she could see the truth. She described Natalia as a master manipulator, someone who threatened to stab family members in their sleep. But none of those claims were corroborated by evidence. During one hearing, the judge reportedly leaned forward and asked quietly, "Mrs. Barnett, even if what you believe is true, did you ever stop to consider that you could be wrong?" Christine hesitated. Her voice cracked when she replied, "If I was wrong, Your Honor, then I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake from." That line echoed in the courtroom, and beyond. It became symbolic of the case itself, a waking nightmare where perception mattered more than proof. In 2019, after years of on and off proceedings, all criminal charges against Michael and Christine Barnett were dropped. The court concluded that the evidence was insufficient to prove neglect beyond reasonable doubt, especially since Natalia's age had been legally changed years before. But that decision didn't exonerate them in the public eye. It only deepened the mystery. If Natalia was a child, she had been abandoned. If she wasn't, the Barnetts were victims of an unimaginable fraud. And if no one could be sure, then the story itself was the crime. After the trial, Natalia's life drifted into obscurity, only resurfacing when journalists went searching. She lived for a time with another family who took her in, the man's family who described her as polite, quiet, and nothing like the monster she was made out to be. She just wanted to be normal. One family member said she wanted to bake cookies, go to church, make friends. She didn't want to talk about what happened. But the past clung to her like a shadow. Strangers sent threats. Neighbors whispered. Even in moments of calm, she could never escape the weight of her own name. Natalia Grace, the orphan, the fraud, the mystery child. Online, her face remained frozen in 1,000 thumbnails, each one claiming to expose the truth. Yet none of those videos told the same story. Michael Barnett faded from the spotlight after his divorce, distancing himself from the chaos. In rare interviews, he seemed broken by the ordeal. "It changed me," he said softly. "I don't even know what I believe anymore." His eyes, hollow and tired, betrayed the cost of chasing answers in a world that thrives on confusion. Christine, on the other hand, became increasingly volatile. She gave erratic interviews, released handwritten notes online, and accused nearly everyone, journalists, doctors, even her own attorney, of conspiring against her. Her obsession, once a defensive shield, became a kind of madness. Meanwhile, Natalia struggled to rebuild her life. She enrolled in community programs, tried to work, tried to smile. But trauma has a way of lingering in silence. Those who met her described a strange aura, a mix of innocence and exhaustion. She looked young, one reporter said after meeting her, but her eyes looked old, like she'd lived several lives already. And maybe she had. When the final documentary aired, years after the case had gone quiet, it brought everything back. The Barnetts and Natalia participated separately, each convinced their version was the real one. Christine's eyes were wild, desperate, Natalia's calm but cold. Neither convinced everyone, each convinced someone. And when the credits rolled, the viewers were left where they started, suspended between empathy and disbelief. Even now, experts continue to analyze the case in journals and podcasts. Some psychologists propose that the Barnetts may have suffered from shared psychosis, a rare condition where one partner's delusions infect the other. creating a shared belief detached from reality. Others insist that Natalia's behavior was unnerving, citing gaps in her medical records, her odd detachment, her inconsistent recollections. Every theory sounds convincing, and yet none can fully explain the chaos. What makes the Natalia Grace story so unforgettable isn't the legal confusion, but the emotional wreckage it left behind. A child who might not be a child, parents who might be victims or villains, a system that wanted resolution but got ambiguity instead. Every participant walked away carrying a different truth, and each truth contradicted the others. There's a quote from one of the detectives who handled the early stages of the case. He refused to appear on camera, but his words survived in transcripts. He said, "Sometimes the scariest cases aren't about blood or murder. They're about people looking at the same thing and seeing two different worlds." That's what the Natalia Grace saga became. Two worlds colliding, love and paranoia, innocence and guilt, fact and fiction, until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. When asked years later what she wanted people to know, Natalia gave a quiet answer that still chills those who heard it. "I never wanted to scare anyone," she said. "I just wanted to be someone's daughter." That's the part no one ever remembered when the headlines screamed. That's the part the world forgot. And so, the case that began with a family seeking love ended as a haunting reminder of how fragile the human need to believe really is. There are stories that fade quietly with time, and there are stories that stain the collective memory, like blood that won't wash out. The story of Natalia Grace belongs to the latter. Years have passed since the Barnett's voices filled courtrooms and headlines, but even now, the echoes refuse to die. In the end, it was never just about a little girl or a family in crisis. It was about the terrifying fragility of perception, about how easily human beings can take something ordinary and twist it into horror when they are afraid. After the trials, after the documentaries, after the chaos burned itself out, Natalia disappeared into anonymity once more. There were reports she moved to a small Midwestern town, that she found new caretakers who tried, truly tried, to give her a normal life. For the first time in years, she attended school again, shopped for groceries without glances, and tried to forget what her name meant to the world. But the internet never forgets. Type her name even now, and what stares back is not a person, but 1,000 versions of her. The orphan girl, the adult imposter, the monster child, each one a distortion of a reality no one ever truly understood. Christine Barnett's life fractured in the years that followed. Her dream of being seen as a visionary mother crumbled under the weight of public distrust. Those who once admired her now whispered about obsession and guilt. She lived, some say, in a constant state of defense, rewriting her own story in interviews, hoping the world would finally believe her. But in that desperate rewriting, she became trapped in the same web of delusion she had woven around Natalia, a web where truth was just one thread among many, impossible to pull free without tearing the whole thing apart. Michael Barnett chose silence. Friends described him as a man trying to start over, someone who avoided cameras, who refused to say her name anymore. "It's not that I don't care," he once told a local reporter who found him years later. "It's that every time I think about it, I start questioning everything I ever knew about myself." In his voice was exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from realizing that truth isn't solid, that memory itself is fragile and cruel. But what about Natalia? What became of the little girl, or woman, at the center of it all? For a while, as she seemed to retreat into herself as though survival meant invisibility, she stopped granting interviews. Her lawyers stopped taking calls, and in that silence, a strange peace settled over her life. For the first time, she wasn't being watched. But peace, for Natalia, was never pure, because peace also meant obscurity, and obscurity meant that her truth would die quietly, buried under everyone else's version of the story. The case faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher horrors. But every few years it resurfaced, like something undead, dragging itself out of the grave to remind us that it had never really ended. A new documentary would promise old herd recordings or shocking evidence, and audiences would click curious, hungry. And each time, it was the same recycled footage, the same photographs, the same hollow questions. Who was Natalia Grace? The haunting part is that no one ever truly wanted to know. They wanted to feel something: fear, pity, disgust. They wanted a story that fit into their own version of the world. A story where they could look at someone else's chaos and think, that could never be me. That's what all good horror does. It convinces us that evil is other people, that safety lies in distance. But this story, the story of Natalia Grace, never allowed that kind of comfort. Because when you strip away the sensationalism, what you're left with is something painfully human: a child who might have been misunderstood, and parents who might have been terrified of their own reflection. It is, at its core, a tragedy of empathy, of people who forgot how to see each other as real. There's a theory among psychologists who studied this case long after it closed. They call it the mirror effect. It suggests that Natalia and Christine were mirrors, each reflecting the other's deepest fears. Christine saw in Natalia a threat to her motherhood, a reminder that she could not save everyone. Natalia saw in Christine the embodiment of rejection, a mother who looked at her and saw something unlovable. In that tension, something dark was born, a story that consumed both of them. Years later, one of the investigators who had handled the case early on was asked whether he thought the mystery would ever be solved. He paused, then said something strange. Maybe it's not meant to be solved. Maybe the mystery is the point. When pressed further, he added quietly, if you stare long enough into that family, you start to see yourself, all the fears, all the lies we tell to feel safe. That's the real horror here. And maybe he was right, because the Natalia Grace case doesn't end with facts. It ends with the realization that truth itself can be a weapon. It ends with two people, one searching for love, the other for control, trapped in a nightmare built from misunderstanding. It ends with a question we're too afraid to answer. What if everyone was telling the truth, just not the same truth? There are stories we forget, and there are stories that never let go. This one, the bizarre orphan case that began as a tragedy and became a global obsession, will always linger, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about us, about how quickly love turns to fear, about how fear becomes hatred, about how, sometimes, the monsters we create look too much like ourselves. And so, as the lights fade on this story, and Natalia Grace's name drifts further into legend, one thought remains, a whisper that chills more than any ghost could. Maybe the scariest part isn't that she lied. Maybe it's that we believed what we needed to believe.